In this tutorial, we will discuss in depth about creating heat maps using the popular GIS software package QGIS. So as we go forward, we intend to cover during this tutorial things like what heat maps are and how they can be useful and what sort of data sets are appropriate to actually generate heat maps and how to generate heat maps using QGIS natively, and finally how to interpret them. So if that all sounds interesting to you, tag along and I'll make sure that by the end of this tutorial, you'll gain a very comprehensive understanding on making heat maps using QGIS. A heat map is just a visual representation of data values, often varying from cool or low value colors to warm or high value colors, and they're typically used to display the density or intensity of spatial data points across an area. They help identify things like patterns such as hotspots where certain phenomena like crime incidents or customer activity or even environmental measurements are basically concentrated. So the dataset that we're going to make use of for generating a heat map today for this tutorial is this kind of a crime incident dataset. And in this dataset, you can see that in total, well, we have almost, if I scroll down to the bottom, 27,000 records. Well, 26,983 records to be specific. So that's a huge dataset. And what it shows is basically crime incidents that happened within and around the city of London in the UK. So as you can see from the columns here, a number of useful information is included, such as when each incident took place in terms of the year and the month, and what sort of a crime incident it was. As it shows over here, things like bicycle theft, burglary, criminal damage, vehicle crime, things like that, and what the outcome happened to be. And most importantly, it comes with a latitude and longitude coordinate dataset as well, which is what's going to make it quite useful in a GIS environment, because with this data, we would be able to import each row or each record of this dataset as a point feature into a GIS and view them as a point plot on a map. This actually is a real dataset, by the way, which was downloaded from the UK Police Data web portal, and just off the shelf, it was not in this sort of a readily usable format. So I had to perform some quick data transformations using Python, and I have documented the entire process in the video linked in the description. If you're keen and think it would be helpful for you, you can definitely go ahead and check it out. But if not, that's totally fine. I'll be providing you with this dataset, with this clean dataset anyway, as a downloadable file, so that you can just follow along the process and see if you would be able to generate your own heat maps or not. So I have saved this dataset as a CSV file, and that's going to make things easier when we import this into QGIS as a text delimited file. So let's just go ahead and close this. And after opening up QGIS, I'm going to make use of my browser panel to navigate into my working folder to access that CSV file, which happens to be this CSV file right over here, crime data in London from 2021 to 2024. And if I just drag it and drop it over here into my workspace, you can see that it gets added as a layer. However, it's not a GIS layer just yet. If you right click and go to open attribute table, you basically would be able to see all those attributes and the records correspondingly as well. You can see that it's varying basically from the month of July of year 2021 all the way until the month of June in 2024. And each month has got, I think, roughly around 600 to 800 records, which makes up the total to be 26,983 records. Alright, now what we are going to do is we're going to make use of this longitude and latitude columns given for each record to convert each entry into a point on a map. And we can do that simply by heading over to layer and go to add layer. And from here you can select add delimited text layer. And from here you can search the file name. Well, basically navigate into the place where you have saved this CSV file, which is this one. After that, you can go ahead and open it. And from here, you can adjust quite a number of things. For example, if you want to add a proper name for the layer, we can just name this as 2024, something like that. And the file format is CSV. And it's quite important to make sure that you properly assign the right fields to X field and Y field. And since we are dealing with decimal degrees over here, the Y field should be latitude and the X field should be longitude. And you can see that it automatically detected that, but in case if the field name happens to be something else, then it becomes your task to properly guide QGIS and help it recognize what the X field is and what the Y field is. Over here, you have to make sure that you select the correct coordinate reference system of the given longitude and latitude data. And of course, in this case, it's WGS 1984 Geographic Coordinate Reference System, which is given by the EPSG code 4326. If for some reason the numbers that you have for X and Y looks completely different to the generally expected structure of latitude and longitude values when they're in EPSG 4326, for example, if it's in a projected coordinate reference system, then the numbers might have 6 or 7 whole numbers, and followed by that maybe a few decimal numbers as well. So just by looking at the number, you probably might be able to tell whether it's in this coordinate reference system or whether it's in a completely different projected coordinate reference system or not. And if the latter happens to be the case, then you have to make sure that you actually find out what that projected coordinate reference system is. And if you don't, you probably won't be able to import it correctly onto the map. So in this case, we don't really have that challenge, so everything seems to be fine. Just go ahead and click on Add. And after that, you can just close this out. So as I told you guys, my data set is supposed to be in London, so you can see that a bunch of points got added within and around London. And with that, you can see that a new layer got added to our layers panel. And if you right click and go to properties and just quickly have a look at the file type, you can see that still it's not really a shapefile. It's still a delimited text file, just that it happens to display it as a point vector file. But it would be quite convenient if we actually just go ahead and convert this into an actual, maybe something like a shapefile, by exporting and saving feature as an S3 shapefile. You could go with maybe another format like GeoJSON as well. That's totally fine. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm just going to go with S3 shapefile. And when it comes to the file name, I'm just going to open up the folder. And maybe let's just go ahead and create a new folder inside my working folder. And I'm just going to name this as points because it's a point shapefile. And click OK. Yeah, after that we can just go ahead and get rid of this delimited text file. Well, just remove the layer. And when creating a heat map, what you can do next is you can right click over here and go to properties. And under symbology, you will be able to see a number of different options. And what we're actually after is this option, which is called heat map. So I'm just going to pick that. And after that, it asks us to select a bunch of different things. Now, usually, as I told you at the beginning of this video, you can display your heat map in a way that the colors actually vary from sort of a generally non-cool color to a generally non-warm color, so that identifying those hotspots or warm areas would be quite convenient. So what I mean by that is something like this. For example, let's say if I go with this spectral color ramp, you can see that it varies basically from red to blue, but I'm assuming that I probably might have to flip this the other way around because I would like to have the hotspot to have red color and, well, the rest of the areas where there's not much of a crime threat to have blue color. So I can again open up this drop down menu, and from here I can select invert color ramp. So there you can see that it gets inverted. And when it comes to the radius, it's quite important. What the radius does is it basically specifies the distance around a point at which the influence of the point will be felt. So if you're not really sure what number to specify right over here, Well, one thing that I can say for sure is that we're going to use something like meters, in this case map units, and assuming that the map units are in meters, we can check that out just in a second. So let's just exit out from here and take this measuring tool, and after that I'm just going to roughly check what is the distance between 2 points, just like that. So you can see that it's roughly about 50 meters, and if I were to include maybe a number of different points in my region of influence, it's going to be about 130 meters. So I'm going to roughly have an idea in my mind that I should provide a value something in range of maybe 50 to 150 or 200 meters as my radius of influence. Well, it can always be changed if the heat map doesn't really appear to be the way you want it to be. So let's head back to properties, symbology, and we can go to heat map again. And from here, I'm just going to pick the same color ramp that I picked previously, and I'm going to invert the color ramp as well. And when it comes to the radius, I'm just going to select map units, and as a starting point, let's just go with about 100 meters and see what happens. And maximum value, I'm just going to set it to be automatic, and weight points by. We're actually going to come to this because it's quite important in the second part of this tutorial. But in our first try, we're just going to leave this as it is. And the rendering quality, well, if you have quite a lot of points, then it might actually take a considerable amount of time for the rendering process to happen. I think this sort of a happy medium would be quite alright, at least as a starting point. And after that, you can just go ahead and select apply and click OK. And with that sort of a radius specification, this is how my heat map happens to look. So you can quite clearly see that there are actually a number of different hotspots. And well, most of the areas are assigned this kind of a blue color, because in a large area like the City of London, it's only going to be a handful of points that are going to be susceptible to this kind of crimes. And that's exactly what gets depicted from this heat map right over here. So you can see these two spots get a very dark kind of a red zone assignment. And since we have a base map from OpenStreetMap, which by the way, if you didn't really have, you can go to your browser panel and scroll down until you get this XYZ tiles. And from here you can see OpenStreetMap. This actually gets pre-installed in newer versions of QGIS. So you just have to drag it and drop it over to your workspace. And if you have this kind of a base map, it's always nice to increase the transparency of your heat map just so that you can see what's going on underneath. So how do you do that? You can do that simply by heading over to properties, and under symbology, in layer rendering, you can, well, basically knock down the opacity just like this. It's always going to be a number that's going to be dependent just on your personal preference. So we can just play around and see what fits the most. You can kind of start seeing what's underneath, but if you want to knock it down just a little bit more, yeah, that's fine as well. As you can see, this area around Liverpool Street in London is probably an area where you need to be careful if you happen to just wander around in the City of London. And since this is a real data set, what we get as conclusions from our analysis is also going to be pretty close to the reality. So in case if you're planning on taking a stroll around the City of London, it's something that you're probably worth noting. I'm also going to show you what the impact of selecting a different radius is going to be to your heat map. So let's head back to properties of our layer, and this time maybe let's go with a radius like 400 meters and select apply. And by doing that, what we did was we increased the distance around a point at which the influence of the point will be felt. And with 400, you can see that the result turned out to be something like this, where the zone of the hotspot is now not really concentrated into a very specific tiny spot, but its influence has sort of spread it around as well. But you can see that it didn't really have an impact to the overall result. We still can come to the conclusion that this is actually one of the more serious hotspots, when it comes to crime. But as you saw, the resolution of the hotspot, if you want to call that, decreased just a little bit. And I'm also going to use a different color ramp just for the purpose of showing you how it would look. So instead of using this color ramp, let's maybe go with this red's color ramp, where the areas corresponding to the hotspots will be shown in this kind of a very dark red color. And when it comes to the radius, I'm just going to put this back to maybe around 120. And after that, click apply and click OK. And with that, you still would be able to see the hotspots around here. And I think we completely overlooked that there are a number of different hotspots around other areas as well. For example, this point right here, around here, and a couple more around here as well. So all of these, based on our analysis, are actually places where we have to be careful, especially if you are new to the area and if you happen to just wander around, because based on the actual data, it shows that they are real crime hotspots. Now, moving on to the second part of this tutorial, one might argue that you probably should not be treating each crime incident equally, because as you can imagine, a life-threatening crime incident is much more dangerous than maybe something like pickpocketing. So one might argue that there should be some sort of a weighting done for each crime incident, and depending on its nature, we should assign some form of rank or a score, and then reproduce the heat maps taking into account that weighting. And remember, if you head back to properties and under symbology, when creating a heat map, you're actually given an option to provide this kind of a weighting, which we ignored because we treated each incident equally, neglecting the seriousness of each crime based on what type of an incident it is. But if you were to expand the drop-down menu right over here, you would be able to see that if you happen to have a new column in your dataset which can tell us that weighting, it can definitely take that weighting into account when generating the heat map. And that's exactly what we are going to do next. So to do that, I'm just going to make a copy of my dataset, well, simply by exporting it again and saving it as maybe a different file in the same location. So this one, I'm just going to name it as London Crime Incident Points. Let's call it R1 and click Save. And I'm just going to turn off the previous heat map which we created. And if I go to the attribute table of my dataset, so ideally what needs to be done is, based on each crime type, there should be another field called something like ranking or weight. And depending on how you perceive each crime types, you can just go ahead and assign a weight. For example, something like antisocial behavior might get a lower weight compared to something like maybe violence or burglary. So it's going to be completely dependent on how we see the seriousness of each crime type. And to make things easy, I have prepared a sheet like this, where together maybe we could just place each of these different crime incidents in this kind of a crime risk weighting, where weight 5 correspond to crime incidents with the highest risk, and weight 1 would reflect crime incidents with the lowest risk based on how I perceive them. And if it's somebody else who is doing this, then they might actually have a different perception. So just for the purpose of this tutorial, let's just maybe go ahead and get this done. Well, this is how I ended up doing it. You may or may not agree. I mean, if you're actually doing this as a serious exercise, then this might need a bit more thinking and probably logical justifications. But let's just go ahead with it for the purpose of this tutorial. And as you can see, what I have done over here is I have assigned number 1 to antisocial behavior and 2, 3, 4, 5 accordingly to these different crimes based on the seriousness of them, as I see. And now the task at hand is actually to create a new column or a new field over here and perform the weight assignment correctly. So you can actually quite easily do that by heading over to this field calculator, and I'm just going to make sure that I leave enough space on the screen just to show that crime risk weighting that we did, just to keep it as a reference. And I'm going to create a new field and I'm going to call it crime weight, or maybe just call weight. And the output field type can be an integer because it's just going to be either 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And output field length, well, I'm just going to put it as 2. And now to assign the weights correspondingly, what you have to do is you have to head over to conditionals, and from here you can select this case expression, because with something like a case expression, you can say that if in this crime type column the value that you find happens to be something like other theft, then assign the corresponding value and move on to the next row and then see what kind of a crime type is here. So if it's theft from person, then assign the corresponding value for that and just move on. So for each row, it's actually going to check what the crime type is, and based on that, it's going to assign the weighting that we specified. And you have to write a small expression to execute that. And if I just double click over here on case, it's what it's going to do is it's going to create a very generic form of this case expression, where it needs to have this case word stated and it needs to have this end word stated as well. So I'm just going to make sure that I leave enough space for the rest of the script, and I'm just going to say that case when, well, now my condition is that I have to refer back to a column where I can find all of these different crime types. So that column is called crime type. So what I can do is I can just basically get rid of this existing condition word, and I can open up these fields and values. And from here, you can see that there's a column called crime type. So I can double click that and it's just going to appear over here. And then we can say that if crime type is equal to, if you go back to our crime risk weighting, number 1 should be assigned to antisocial behavior. So I'm just going to type over here antisocial behavior, and then the result should be equal to 1. And down here you can see that it actually gives us some sort of a quick preview of what the value of this antisocial behavior feature is going to be. And you can see that based on the preview, it says that it's going to be 1, just like what we assigned over here. For example, if I happen to assign something like 50, you can see that in the preview it shows that it's 50. So you kind of get the sense that the expression did work. And if you expand this drop down menu and maybe select a different type of a crime, burglary, you can see that the value, if I were to run this expression that gets assigned for burglary, is null because we didn't really specify any value for burglary. So that's how it works. I'm just going to put this back to be 1, and now it just becomes a matter of patiently doing this for each crime type. And for risk weighting 2, we can see that we have 3 different crime types, and I'm going to manually add all 3 as well. Theft from the person, and that should get 2. So you can quickly double check that as well if you have any such features displayed over here. Yeah, for example, this, you can see that it actually gets a value of 2. And similarly, it needs to, well, we need to add the other 2 as well, which is other theft and public order. Alright, so I'm just going to fast forward the video because you guys get the idea. And if you're just following along, you can just take your time to assign these weights by yourself as well. Alright guys, I think that's about it. You can see that I pretty much got everything on our crime risk weighting diagram over to the field calculator as one large expression. And as you can see, all the weights get assigned corresponding to according to the seriousness of the crime. And now we can just go ahead and click OK and see if it runs or not. Yeah, you can see that it basically just took a second for it to create a new column and assign basically a weight for each crime type. And now all we have to do is just, well, after that we can just go ahead and save the edits. And then we can head over to Properties, Symbology, Heatmap, and I'm going to select the same color ramp. And just for consistency, let's set this to be 120 as well. And now this time, we are going to weight the points by this newly created field called weight. And we'll execute this and see how the results look and whether it's going to be much different from the heat map that we originally had. Click Apply and click OK. And just for comparison purposes, maybe we'll go ahead and increase the transparency a bit as well. Click Apply. And you can see that in terms of the location of the hotspot, it didn't actually change the result that much. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to activate the previously created heat map as well. And for this particular example, you can see that the difference is actually not that much, even though I do notice a very slight difference in the results. But the intention was for you guys to actually learn the process of basically assigning a weight to different records that you potentially might have, because sometimes it might not be fair to treat each record with the same significance, especially if you're talking things like crime incidents and things of that nature. So that actually brings us to the end of this tutorial. I hope it was useful for you guys. If you do have any questions, don't forget to add a comment down below as well. And I'll see you again with another tutorial soon.